Hello. You wanted to know more about Colombians living in Belgium, in Brussels? Well, the story of current Colombian immigration begins in the 1970s, but especially in the 1980s and 90s. Then many Colombian women, migrants, arrived in Belgium. So when I was researching Colombian migration in the 90s, it was mainly with Colombian women that I became acquainted with. They were the focus of my research, and so the story I tell you today is mainly about them. The departure point was Colombia, and in the 1980s and 90s, several neighborhoods in Colombian major cities, Medellin, Cali and Bogota, were rather dangerous. For example, there was a drug war going on, coupled with extortion or retaliation between the drug cartels of Medellin and Cali. You may have heard the name of Pablo Escobar, the Netflix series Narcos, you know? The desire to escape this climate of violence played an important role among Colombian women who migrated, but it was rarely the main reason for most to leave. The prime reason was the economic situation. Married, unmarried and divorced women left Colombia for Belgium. They were often between the ages of 20 and 40. Their partner, if any, remained in Colombia, and if they already had children, they often initially left them with relatives. Only once the women had settled in Belgium did she try to bring them over. Some women had some professional training. Not all had completed high school, but most already had professional experiences. Before they left, they worked, for example, as laborers, such as in the textile industry in Medellin, as staff in shops, as lower-level employees, or self-employed in small businesses of their own, like a hairdresser, for instance. You could say that these women belonged to a lower middle class. Colombia offered them few economic prospects. There were mainly low wages and a relatively high cost of living. Life in Colombia consisted of living paycheck to paycheck, making ends meet, buy on credit, hoping no unforeseen expenses popped up. To make this concrete, they usually had to get by a salary of 1 or 2 minimum wages. In 1990, the monthly minimum wage was about 70 euros, and even today it's only 325 euros. On top of that, day-to-day products there are very expensive in relation to these wages. To give some examples from today's life, a kilo of rice, which is important food for them, daily food, it costs 2 euros in Belgium a kilo, and in Colombia 1 euro. A kilo of tomatoes costs 2.5 euros here, while people pay about half in Colombia. A liter of milk, a kilo of apples, the same price as here. So even if some products cost only half or a third of ours, life is still very expensive. The women were often single heads of households. They were economically responsible for themselves and their children. In addition, they also contributed to the income of the parental home. They often continue to do so during the migration. Part of the money they earned here was sent for the entire family unit. The women brought their dreams to Belgium, hoping to realize them here. In Colombia there is an expression, casa, carro, beca, that refers to the big dreams, the achievements that symbolize progress for a family. A house, a car, and being able to study, a scholarship. The car is not only a means of transportation or a status symbol. In many cases, it is also seen as an employment because it's used as a taxi. Usually, they left with the idea of staying abroad temporarily for a few years to send and save money and then return. Immigration was acceptable and feasible for these women to pursue these dreams. Moreover, it was often already tried by others before them. In the neighborhoods from which these individuals came, every family had at least some relatives, friends and neighbors outside of Colombia. Initially, and already in the 1940s and 50s, there was migration to Venezuela. Later there was also the migration to the United States, and then Europe came into the spotlight as a destination. London, Madrid and Brussels. At the beginning of the 1980s, there were not many Colombians in Brussels. There were about 25 to 50 people at that time, so they say. But these few people provided the basis on which the migration could substantially grow. After all, those who were already here were the reason and the bridge that brought others to Belgium. Migration from Colombia, as well as from other countries, is what is called chain migration. And this is mainly started in the mid-80s. People came to Belgium not so much because of their image of this country. Most did not really know where they would end up to. Certainly not in the beginning. But they came because they knew someone here. A family member, a friend, a neighbor, a sister, a colleague at work. They became part of the chain. The person who already lived and worked in Belgium was extremely important. For example, the new migrants often received financial assistance with the crossing. The money for the ticket, it was paid or they could borrow it. But her presence in Belgium especially offered the newcomer the certainty that she could turn to a compatriot, a friend, a family member who already knew the ins and outs and who could help her, especially in the beginning, in this completely unknown world. So how was life in Belgium? Well, most women found work as femme de ménage, as a cleaning lady. Exceptionally, for example, they could also help look after children, were housekeepers for seniors. In Colombia, they would not work as a cleaning lady because this profession and the person doing it are often looked down upon. In Belgium, however, most experienced respect and appreciation for their work and their person, and many had a good relationship with the female employers. Some even developed a more or less personal relationship, a friendship with them. They talked with these women about their lives, their situation in Colombia and in Belgium, and found understanding, emotional support, and all kinds of help. What about the men? The story of the men who came to Belgium were often similar. For them too, chain migration was access to Belgium, often through the women who were already here. They were employed in the construction sector, mainly restoration of existing buildings, painting, carpentry, etc. A few also found work in a restaurant. Now, an important fact was that most of these women and men came here without a residence permit, without papers. Until 2015, there was a visa requirement for Colombians, and such a visa was very difficult to obtain. So they arrived often in Europe via other countries where no visa was required, and then they traveled on to Belgium. As such, Germany was the gateway for a long time. Staying without papers, without the necessary documents, it affected many aspects of their life. It made it difficult, for instance, to rent an apartment, to open a bank account, and the absence of social security. In 1994, for example, the Medical Support Center for Undocumented Migrants was established, as obtaining medical care was often very problematic. Meanwhile, also other organizations had started paying attention to the difficulties of these new undocumented migrants, such as La Casa de América Latina, La Amistad Colombo-Belga, and various church organizations. Due to their illegality, they were also very vulnerable, including to exploitation, and they were often dependent on the goodwill of people here, including their employer or other Belgians they met. There was also continuous great uncertainty and fear. What if they were arrested? After all, the possibility of being sent back home always hung over their heads. 25 years later, while the number of Colombians in Brussels was estimated at 8,000 to 10,000 in the mid-90s, according to some information sources, there resided about 6,000 to 7,000 Colombians in Belgium between 2014 and 2019. Even now, Colombians are still migrating to Belgium. Since there is no longer a visa requirement, people can now enter the country as a tourist. But this does not grant long-term residence and work rights, which means that they also live and work here without papers. Chain migration still remains a dynamic for many new migrants. Those who venture out just like that, without knowing anyone here, are rather limited. Although through social media, they can make contact and gather information in advance. Even today, violence is not the immediate reason for leaving, and the economic situation seems to be the main reason for migration. Newcomers still often work as cleaning lady. Through Facebook, however, one can see that there are many additional informal activities, whether complementary or not. Several women and men offer their services, like sewing and mending, home restoration, hairdressing, beauty care, language classes, dance classes, or they sell Colombian dishes, mainly in the weekends. Besides these estimates, there are also statistics, but they only talk about the legal Colombians in Belgium, Colombians with legal residence. For 2018-2020, they mentioned around 2,000 persons. So this is significantly lower than these other numbers. However, it is interesting to note that the number of Colombians with legal residence has more than tripled between 1992 and 2020. So let's look at these Colombians with legal residence, because of course they are also part of the Colombian community, Colombians in Brussels. On the one hand, probably some of the people I met in the 1990s are part of these legal Colombians. I have really no idea what became of all the women I once met. Some have returned to Colombia, but many have stayed here and built their lives here. They probably no longer live in Etterbeek, Ixelles, Saint-Gilles, Schaerbeek, or the center of Brussels where they used to live, but in other boroughs, or they might even have moved away from the city. I dare to assume that most of them has been able to regularize their residence in the meantime. Some took part in the collective regularizations that took place in 2000 or in 2009. Some were regularized for humanitarian or medical reasons, others due to a marriage with a Belgian or a new Belgium. I wonder what impact the switch had, the switch from an irregular to a recognized status. What was the impact on their work situation? Did they keep cleaning? Did they do other jobs after that? We have heard about Colombians who have started their own businesses, a construction company, a moving company. And of course, some of the people I met might have retired in the meantime. During my research, I also met several children. They are now in their mid-30s or mid-40s. They went to school here, so also they are part of the Colombian community. Or do they rather consider themselves Belgians? How did their life go? Little is also known about them. When Spain fell into a deep economic crisis in 2011-2012, it is said that many Colombians left the country to try their luck elsewhere, including in Belgium. And look at some new Colombians who arrived here straight away with legal residence. Family reunification, studies and work together accounted for 77% of residence permits issued to Colombians in 2019. At the first place, there are the family reunifications. They are reunification with family members who already resided in Belgium. But also mixed marriages and relationships have led Colombians into the statistics. Colombian men, and mainly women, followed their hearts and married the Belgians. In 2019, about 200 people received a residence permit for family reunification, and almost half of these were Colombian partners of EU citizens. There is a long history of presence of Colombians at various Belgian educational institutions. Already in 1928, there were 24 Colombian students who were enrolled in Leuven at the KU Leuven. But also today, even more, numerous Colombians are studying in different institutions. Due to the presence of a number of Colombian companies such as Avianca, Banacol, the National Federation of Coffee, and other companies, especially in the port of Antwerp, there are several Colombian expats. In addition, there were then and also now a number of other groups of Colombians who reside here legally. Several Colombian political refugees have been living in Belgium since the 1980s. There has been political violence in Colombia already since the mid-1960s, committed by various actors such as guerrilla groups, right-wing paramilitaries, etc. Although nowadays it has been a little bit less. For an entire period, applications were rather limited. Yet at the beginning of the 21st century, there appeared to be a somewhat higher demand. And an increase in application was observed again, especially from 2017 onwards. Finally, in the 1990s, many Colombian children were adopted by Belgian parents. For example, between 1992 and 2005, which is 13 years, 120 Colombian children were adopted, and this number is probably still an underestimate, given that a number of free adoption without government involvement, they were not included in the statistics. New stricter adoption laws came into effect in 2005, and between 2005 and 2020, 15 years, only 12 Colombian children were adopted. Well, there is no doubt also that some Colombians have also disappeared from the statistics after they obtained Belgian nationality. It is remarkable, or perhaps not so, that there is little contact between the different groups. For example, students engage little with undocumented migrants. There seem to be many groups that live relatively side by side, and so there may be not really a Colombian community, rather communities. In addition to the fact that everyone has, of course, their own background, different interests and objectives, this could be also linked to a rather typical Colombian cultural phenomenon. There is such a thing as juntos pero no revueltos, indicating sharing activities, respecting each other, but preferring not to mingle too much with the other and keeping a certain distance. Let's finally look where we can still find Colombians' presence in Brussels. Like many other migrant groups, Colombian migrants brought with them customs from their own country, and they are reproducing a bit of Colombia here. First of all, Colombians are predominantly Catholic, and many of them attend Mass. First of all, Colombians are predominantly Catholic, and many of them attend Mass every week. Already in the 1980s, there were places in Brussels where Mass was said in Spanish. Initially, this was for the Spanish immigrants, but Latin American immigrants, and in particular Colombians, found a way to these churches, such as St. Anthony Parish in Etterbeek. In the 1990s, the sisters associated with this church provided meetings, and in these meetings there was a little coffee, a cookie, a conversation, and where necessary help. So people didn't just come to church to celebrate Mass, but they found fellow countrymen. They could socialize here and also seek support, express their problems, etc. Two Guatemalan sisters in particular became the driving force behind the very extensive and creative pastoral work in the 1990s. A weekend school was even organized for Colombian children, so to teach them their language, the history and geography. French language lessons were organized for adults, and there were various recreational activities. Family trips were organized to the Efteling, to Bruges, to processions, to parades, or to the sea. Over the years, the church and the church community of Notre Dame au Riche-Clair in the heart of Brussels became the most important church for the Colombians, and from 2000 also for all other Latin American immigrants who arrived, people from Ecuador, Bolivia, Honduras, Paraguay. There are also other Spanish-speaking Catholic communities and celebrations of Mass in 7 Brussels parishes, including a very important one, Notre Dame Immaculate in Kuregem-Anderlecht, where there is a statue of El Divino Niño del 20 de Julio. It's one of the most popular religious images in Colombia. The statue in the church was brought from Colombia in the luggage of an immigrant, and this statue is therefore the symbol of migration for the faithful. It is celebrated every second Sunday of the month, and there's even an annual procession. Now, Colombians, they love parties, they love dancing and music. Rumbear. There were, and still are, several places in Brussels where Latin American music is played. A very symbolic place is La Cartagena, which opened its doors in 1986 as a meeting place, a discotheque where Colombians could find a typical ambiance, the atmosphere of home, Colombian rum, aguardiente, and rumbear. When salsa and merengue also became popular in Belgium, these discos attracted a wider audience. An important moment that has occurred annually since 2012 is the cultural event Intercamerenbos on the occasion of the celebration of Colombian national holiday, which traditionally is on the 20th of July, where many Colombians enjoy the music, including live concerts, folkloric dances, and other cultural activities. There are food stalls with Colombian and other Latin American dishes and drinks, and very typical Colombian handicrafts are sold. Visitors can literally and figuratively taste the various aspects of Colombian culture. During various periods, there were in Brussels also radio stations, some broadcasting via internet with Latin American music and news, which therefore became part of daily life. Yes, Colombians like to eat their own typical dishes. And there are a number of shops where you can buy Colombian products. Arepas, frijoles, manzana postobón, a soft drink, rum, aguardiente, fresh buñuelos, arepa huevos, palitos de quesos, fritangas. And there has already been a small company which now is making the arepas here in Belgium so that they no longer have to be imported from Colombia. Colombians like home-cooked food. Either they cook themselves, but especially on weekends, there are a number of people who dedicate themselves to preparing all kinds of typical dishes and offer them for sale. Morcilla, chorizos, empanadas, tamales de tres carnes, and there are the birthday cakes, Colombian flavors that transport them back home. In Brussels, there are about 5 restaurants that offer Colombian food. One of them only offers Colombian cuisine and is run by a family that has been here for more than 30 years. During my research and for many years, there was a football team for indoor football, La Gran Colombia. About 40 Colombian men played at that time on Sunday afternoon. Tournaments were even organized with different teams of Latin American immigrants. Of course, the men of that time have long since played out, but the new generation have taken over. Currently, the new paspis represent the Colombian colors at the provincial level. An important difference from before is that there appears to be a greater political involvement and commitment to Colombia. Following the national strike in Colombia in 2021, manifestations were also organized in Brussels, where Colombians were present. Over the years, also various organizations have emerged that fight for human rights in Colombia, such as Comité pour le respect des droits humains Daniel Girard and CBC, Belgian Coordination for Colombia. It is not clear how strongly Colombians themselves are committed to all these organizations. Finally, social media are a completely new phenomenon since the period I was doing research. There are several groups now on Facebook, Colombians in Brussels, Colombianos in Belgium, and they are the gateway to exchange information about each other, and for you to get to know the community of Colombians a little bit better.